वही आ रहा है, इस पे भी नहीं आ रहा।
Good evening, everyone, to all our participants in India, and good morning to everyone in the US and other parts of the world. And so my name is Kala Chakradhar. I am going to be the moderator for today's session. And I'm originally from India, but I've now been in the States for more than a decade. My background is in social work, and I'm also a clinical practitioner. I'm glad to be part of this MAP India team and moderate and also work with Deborah Horowitz, who is our presenter today. I just want to first thank you all for being here this Tuesday evening. I know it might have been a work day for you all. For us here in the US, we are coming back after a long holiday. So thank you for being here. So before I introduce our presenter, I also want to share about MAP INDEAR, which is this collective of South Asian and non-South Asian mental health professionals who have come together mainly to support essential workers in India with COVID-19 and what we are all experiencing as helping professionals. And so this organization mainly focuses on offering trainings in relation to psychological first aid and also various other training opportunities in relation to de-escalation and anything that really impacts us as part of being service professionals. Introducing Deborah. I'm glad to have associated with Deborah Horowitz, whose background is in social work. She has a master's degree in social work and is also a licensed clinical professional. She has more than 2 decades of experience. She's not only a clinician, but also highly involved in research in the healthcare field. Her credentials also include a wide experience in various treatment forms, including cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, and other psychodynamic approaches. And her main focus has been to do with trauma interventions and also to do with safety for professionals and various, so in relation to first aid and understanding violence and also supporting people in understanding and intervening in all forms of violence at different levels. And one of Deborah's key skills is also to do with leadership and team building. So she has wide experience with that in working with organizations, working as a team member, and also in leading and also training others in leadership. She primarily works right now for the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health, where she provides trainings all over the state. And she's done this for the past more than 15 years. And she's been also recognized for her work, her skills in leadership, being the recipient of the Partners in Excellence Award for Teamwork. And she's also won recognition for her research and also her authorship. She's participated and contributed in multiple conferences and in programs related to staff development. So I'm glad to welcome Deborah, and I'm happy to have been a month or two, and I see that she's a person this pandemic as well. So I will invite Deborah to begin her presentation. So today's presentation is mainly, as you all know, this series of trainings being offered are 5 in all, beginning with today's focus on theoretical models of trauma, violence, and safety. So a little bit to do with the housekeeping for today before I hand it over to Deborah. I think all of you present here can use the chat box to introduce yourselves. We'd like to get to know you in terms of who you are, what your backgrounds are. That'll help us connect with you as you come up with questions or want to share or know more in relation to the presentation. I will be monitoring the chat, so if you have questions as you go, please feel free to put it on the chat, and as I will be monitoring, so in between we can pause for questions, so Deborah will be able to respond to that. We can also have questions at the end, to look at anything that we've missed and also wrap up the session. Okay, thank you. Welcome again, and over to you, Deborah.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Kala, for that very well said. Thank you, biography. I appreciate that very much. It has been delightful as well to work with you through all of this, as well as it has been to work with Uma, with INDEAR, and with Nancy, who is also in the room with us today. So we're going to talk about violence, the theoretical models today. We're going to talk about them from a macro level, a meso level, and a direct micro level. Some of the things that we're going to talk about today can be challenging. They can activate people in ways we might not intend. And so what I want to invite you to do is 2 things. 1, take care of yourselves throughout this whole session, this one and the 4 more that follow it. If you need to speak with somebody because you are activated, given what you're going through and seeing every day, please ask for Nancy in the chat. She can set aside some time to just talk with you a little bit more. And then mostly, I would like us all to think a little more critically about how we understand violence, the impact that it has, the purpose that it serves, and how best to mitigate it. I can see that there are a number of psychologists in the room. Thank you so much for coming this morning. And there are some MDs, and I'm very grateful that all of you are here today. I hope by the end of this day's presentation that you will feel inspired enough to want to continue through the next 4. And then maybe perhaps some of you might want to learn how to train this yourselves. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. I tend to run this more like a conversation. I invite your questions, I invite your wisdom, I invite your even disagreement with some of the concepts. I want us to really feel safe enough to delve into quite a bit of this material. So I will start right now sharing my screen. If you have trouble seeing this, please let someone know. And we will begin. Right. 1 second. I have to close me. All right. So I want us to start thinking about from the beginning. How is violence defined in your community? In other words, what is recognized as violence in the community you currently live in? When you're in India, how is violence depicted? How do you recognize it? Those are the things that I want you to take a moment and then just put it in the chat to kind of get us started with already what you know. And you can also write it down for yourself if you feel as if you are beginning to formulate that, because I'm hoping by the end of today, you'll have a better sense of the violence and the experience in your area, in your community. All right. Behavior which harms someone, absolutely. Physical, psychological, absolutely. So there is this element, yes, of force, but it doesn't always have to be like assault or physical. There are other kinds of violence. Very, very true. And here's what we mean when we talk about violence. We're talking about it on multiple levels. So the first is this notion of institutional violence. This is the ideology that people hold. It is the belief system about who matters and who doesn't, who is deemed worthy, who is deemed unworthy, who gets the resources, who is denied access. And it takes the form of stigma, racism, classism, sexism, and discrimination. That dominant ideology needs to be kept in place by something. And so these are the structural mechanisms. These are the policies and the procedures and the values and the norms that keep the status quo in place. So for example, wars, genocides, riots, unemployment, involuntary hospitalization, incarceration, poverty. These are the things that are designed within the system to keep those beliefs about who is important and who isn't in place. And in some cases, to try and expand those power bases. All of this is happening to us very invisibly most of the time. We often don't stop to think about the structures that are in place. We tend to take them for granted. And those who are at the top, those who are deemed worthy, most worthy, aren't even aware that the rest of it exists for anybody else because they never have to worry about it. And often when violence begins to touch them is when we begin to see this push for change. All of this is, again, weighing very heavily on each and every one of us, whether we're aware of it or not. And it comes down to what happens between you and me, and also how I think about myself. So it could be that I internalize and I take in the negative belief systems about the group that I am affiliated with, and I turn it around and I hurt myself. Maybe there's self-harm, maybe there's a suicide attempt, maybe there's other self-destructive behavior. Or I can turn it outwards towards another group, particularly a group that I deem, or that the major structure deems, lesser than myself. So these are all operating. So whenever you're seeing a conflict or an escalation, and somebody says to the other one, I don't know what happened, he or she just snapped, it's because the lens isn't quite broad enough. That's what we want to do today. And so how do we understand this in your context? I want to let you know that I am by no means an expert on Indian culture, but it does have some similarities with other societies, other cultures that have this institutional and structural and direct mechanisms of violence embedded in it. The institutional mechanisms here are designed to reinforce the caste system, and you can see obviously the pyramid on the right. This is designed to impose or maintain order. It's also used as a way to justify behavior toward other groups, and often it's based in perception about the divine will and the laws of nature, meaning that what it is seen as is God's gift. And so we have the Brahma here as the grandfather of all the worlds, and the Indian caste system being seen as that, having that divine will. This is also happening here with race in America. Absolutely, Black and people of color over here are seen as lesser, and it has been promoted in Catholicism and in other forms of Christianity that it's due to a divine will and the laws of nature. So when you have an ideology that mixes with a structural context, which is what happens here, you get people who are in incredibly prescribed roles. And you can see the roles in which, in your culture, from my research, this is what's meant, right? So we have the Dalit who are untouchable on one end, and the Brahmin who are the ones nearest to God on the other end. And the further apart those castes are, and also being tied up with classism, the more likely you are to wind up having some kind of civil unrest. In this case, right now, what is happening for doctors is a subsidiary of that, is a sequelae of that. And I hope to be able to talk with you a little bit more about that. But in any structural mechanism that thrives on a power over and a power not under or non-existent is more likely to have escalating and challenging behaviors. Why? Because there is seen as those who are completely unworthy and those who are completely worthy. So as we were talking about that, if we're thinking about how mechanisms of violence, structural mechanisms of violence, those very things that you said in the chat have everything to do with what forms they take. So there can be family violence or domestic abuse, peer or group violence, and you'll see it in schools, in gangs, in bullying. There can be sexual violence, abuse of power, mistreatment of those who are smaller or less powerful. Sometimes this takes the form of corruption and bribery. Community violence, which is what's happening in sort of the mob violence you're experiencing. Hate crimes and hate speech, and how you are depicted in the media, television, film, and song, and video games. These forms of violence are the structural mechanisms that keep that ideology in place. Who matters and who doesn't? Who matters is often the perpetrator. Who doesn't is often disenfranchised. And often it is about this mindset of scarcity of resources and who should have access and control over them. So here's some food for thought. And I'd like you to answer in the chat if you don't mind. What if each of those classes and castes in India had not been separated by a ranking system? What if India had no ranking system? What do you think might happen in terms of violence as we understand it thus far? Please feel free to answer. This is where we get a chance to really think critically. And oftentimes we can't even imagine what it might be like. That's how embedded it is. It's so seen as the norm that we don't often, we aren't often clear about what something different might look like. No hatred amongst people regarding, yes. No racism would exist. Yes. When we have this ability to be empathic and to share our ideas, our resources, very often there's no need for the violence. Violence always serves a purpose. All behaviors, meaningful behavior, which is one of the next topics that we'll cover. Now, if you hold on one moment, I will stop sharing my screen for a moment because we got stuck. Resources and rights would be uniform. It might not be uniform, but it might be far more equitable. it's not that everybody would be the same, but there would be an attempt or a desire to make sure that everybody had opportunity, equality in gender, less resentment of the upper class, absolutely. And resentment plays a large role in violence. Yep, everyone would have their base level of needs met. And as we know from Maslow's hierarchy of needs, physical safety, and we'll talk more about the other domains, are vital to creating an environment free of escalations and minimizing the risk. I'm sharing my screen. And so if we think, what if each person in each of those classes had elements of the other ones? You were already talking about it. There might be less inequality. There might be more equity. There might be less resentment, which is really key here, and less shame. And you were talking very clearly that the violence would be mitigated. This happens over and over and over again, whether it's United States culture or other countries or yours. This power over and power under dynamic often leads to violence. And so when we think about, well, why don't we just change it? Well, because it's easier to blame the victim. It's easier to blame the one who is already disenfranchised, who already is deemed unworthy, than it is to dismantle or deconstruct the whole system in which that power imbalance is embedded. And so this is why change often takes not only decades, but centuries. And for the most part, it's invisible. And it keeps, by design, other factions fighting with each other so that they're diverted, their attention is diverted from the ideology that's holding them above. And so I want us to think about, when we're engaging with people, how all of that is impinging on people. And this is David Rock's SCARF model of engagement. And he's got 5 components to this: status, certainty, autonomy, related, and fairness. And the more people are connected by each one of these, the further away from threat they get. The greater the discrepancy between them, the closer to threat they become. So what we want people to understand is that status and autonomy are very much, status and relatedness are very much welded together. Status being that of my caste, that of my job, that of my position, versus the relatedness. How much or how little can I relate to you based on my given experiences? So if there is a large divide in status between 2 people, 2 groups, or 2 societies, their ability to relate to one another may be a bit more challenging. Okay? Remember, we often code differences as threats in our brain. And so it becomes, when we are wedded to our status, in the case of Brahmin and other castes, the ability to relate to or even see the needs of another is very different. And then there is autonomy, and that's related to fairness, right? You can have a fair situation if each individual has autonomy to make a decision or a choice. If there is no autonomy by one party and the other one holds all of the decision-making power, do you think that the situation is likely to be fair? And what that also does is set up this need for a compensatory response. Because when people feel that they've been treated unjustly or unfairly, there's a compensatory response to make it right. How people make that right can be very different. It can be pro-social, as in sort of peaceful protesting, dialogues, mediation, supporting one another, voting, civil actions of that nature, or it can be maladaptive, vandalism, riots, burning things, etc. The tipping point here is the certainty. The less certain people are about where they fit, the less certain they are about the situation, the more likely they're going to encode these things as a threat. And this is where we are in the pandemic right now. This is where doctors are having to choose or not have enough of the resources they need. And for patients and families not to know whether their loved one will survive or whether they will be disabled following COVID. So this time of uncertainty makes the gap between the status and the relatedness and the autonomy and the fairness that much greater, which means ultimately that we need to use more of the tools to de-escalate and avoid conflicts.
Yeah, Deborah,
And
there
so-
was a
Oh, please,
comment.
yes, go ahead.
There was a comment here from Ripunjay Kumar, who says that violence on caste, creed, and religion happens all over the world. To
Yes, it
overcome
does.
to overcome it, the basic education system needs to change, where it is taught that one type of person is better than the other.
Mhm. So yes, it does need to, the educational system is only one institution that needs to change. What's insidious about this is that it is infected and driven in all of our systems. Our healthcare system, our war systems, our defense systems, our education, our agriculture, all of our systems are impacted by this. And so it becomes vital that we can see it for what it is before we dismantle it. Otherwise, what has happened over and over will happen again. We'll pull one factor out and wonder why everything else didn't change. So it's understanding the insidious nature of this and the underpinnings of this. And yes, absolutely, this happens all over the world, and we're going to spend some time talking about that as well.
Yeah, and
Thank you for that
Murugan
comment.
says that the only thing we need to know is human, nothing like caste or religion, but name it as human. That should be the only religion.
Well, I do agree that there is something that pulls us together that is stronger than anything else. Our human universal connections, our same ideas, our same feeling states, our shared experiences. Absolutely, I would agree with that. And when they're not, right, when we're not shared, we feel or can experience trauma. And one of the definitions is the experience of violence and victimization, including sexual abuse, physical abuse, severe neglect, loss, domestic violence, terrorism, or disasters. And those cover those in the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5. But individual trauma is results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that are experienced by an individual as harmful or life-threatening, and has an adverse effect on all areas of their well-being. Trauma is in the eye of the beholder, or as I should say, the experiencer. It's about the impact. It's not about intent. The impact is, and how people associate meaning and make meaning of events has everything to do with how the trauma is processed and whether or not it will be perpetuated. And I will show you ways in which that it does, in fact, violence gets transmitted. Because we do know that the effects of trauma disrupt our ability to integrate information. If you are in fight, flight, freeze, or appease mode, you are not going to encode in your memory anything not directly related to that survival. So if we have traumatized kids in schools, they're not integrating their math homework. They're not integrating the comprehension and reading because they're in fight, flight, or freeze mode. So we have to also do something about what happens in the home, what happens in the family, what happens in the aftercare programs, et cetera. And when trauma affects the brain, it impairs our ability to regulate mood and affect. Those things that fire together, wire together in the brain. And when you have this constant influx of cortisol, that actually changes your brain chemistry, which makes judgment and reason not be online quite a bit of the time. So people become overwhelmed by even the ordinary things in life. And they also become much more primed to react as each one of these things accumulates. Because trauma has a cumulative effect, And if we were looking at those mechanisms of violence, not only is it accumulating interpersonally, but structurally and ideologically all the time. So the big T's are those that are in the DSM-5. Exposure to actual or threatened death, exposure to war, being kidnapped, natural or man-made disasters. These are these big T's. But there are some things about the DSM-5 that people don't know. One, this trauma is considered to be perpetuated on a fully developed adult brain. What do we know? We know that a lot of childhood trauma occurs before people reach adulthood, right? It also finally talks about that our healthcare workers, in the exposure to their work and the things that they see, can experience traumatic symptoms, vicarious trauma, the experiencing of the trauma sort of by exposure to. But yet, we still haven't talked about the developmental trauma disorders that should be coming and understanding the pervasiveness of it in terms of other kinds of big T's, including medical catastrophe. Here we are in the middle of a major pandemic with something that we cannot see with the naked eye, that is incredibly uncertain. And so we are, because we've already experienced trauma in our own lives, primed to react even more so here. And then I want us to remember that there are the little T's that people don't often talk about. These are relationship traumas. These occur over time. They can be repeated or chronic, could be intentional, unintentional, overt or covert. But what they do is they betray, they have an element of shame and betrayal attached. And because of that, they have as much psychological impact on the individual as any of those big T's, yet they often are unrecognized for what they are. They may still very much overwhelm the individual's ability to cope because they are still feeling disempowered, feeling incredible fear with a profound loss of control. And little T's can be intergenerational and historic. Even if you yourself are not aware of something that occurred several generations ago in your family or your culture, you are still being impacted by it. This is about systems impact, not just one-to-one individuals. And so what do we also see? 1,000 little cuts, these microaggressions and microinequities. These are the unintentional, sometimes unconscious slights. People don't say hello. They mispronounce our name on purpose. They ask for things that are hurtful, but they don't recognize it as such. So let me give you an example. My last name is Horowitz, and I went to buy a house. And the real estate agent said to me, "Oh, Ms. Horowitz, you're going to buy this house? Great. It's a block away from the temple." She didn't know how I felt about my own religion or ethnicity, but made that assumption. So microaggressions are about assumptions, unconscious biases, things that come out. Again, this is also the insidious nature of what we're talking about. It comes out in violent language towards people. The word trigger that we were using for trauma for so many years. Well, a trigger is something on a gun. That's a violent kind of language. So we really want to be paying attention to how we can curb the microinequities. And so when you have the institutional and the structural and the direct and the microaggressions, what do you think happens when an entire group is subjected to trauma? Please feel free to put it in the chat. What do you think happens to that entire group?
There was a question whether the participants will be getting some reference materials.
Yes, we can send some out afterwards. Sure, yes. Absolutely. if we think about the impact on one individual, does it get compounded? It becomes part of their biology. Exactly, exactly. It literally changes DNA. Cultural trauma is when a whole collectivity is subjected to an event or events that forever marks their consciousness as a group. And by doing so, that changes the course of their future identity in ways that are fundamental and irrevocable. So when we think about things like the Holocaust or the Rwandan genocide, all the way through American slavery, apartheid, you do see this happening on a global scale. And the effect on those populations, that's had an indelible mark. Think about what South Africa is known for. The first thing that comes to mind, right? Or we think about what we've done to indigenous peoples here in the United States. What we've essentially done is eradicate a person's identity, a belief system, a value system, in order to make sure that the dominant structure stays in place. So there's an exploitation of resources, of people, of money. So all of these things are by design to keep other people in power and make others lesser. And what's behind the anger that we see from people now is fear. Fear of some kind of additional loss. For people who've already experienced trauma, there's already been tremendous loss. Now there may be a loss of certainty, a loss of a family member, a loss even further of autonomy, loss of livelihood. And what happens with that is that the fear becomes intolerable and they need an outlet. So people will then have a very angry presentation because they've already lost so much, and losing one more thing or person can be the tipping point. And this is what you're seeing when you're seeing family attendants attacking a doctor in mob violence or even individually. You're seeing them, the people who are doing the violence, having experienced more fear of losing everything that they have when they have so little to begin with. And many of the doctors are surprised by the level of violence directed towards them. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that they often belong to a group that hasn't traditionally had to worry about their own personal safety.
Yeah, Deborah,
So, yes, please.
Says in terms of loss, there's also loss of dreams.
Oh, absolutely. Loss of dreams, loss of future, loss of creativity, loss of hope. Loss of hope is a big factor. Beautiful. Everyone in this room has got so much wisdom. It's what is currently happening. Yes, it is. It is what is happening in Afghanistan right now. Yes. And so you are now seeing that mass trauma perpetuated by the dominant culture, right? So in Afghanistan, right, we now have the Taliban eradicating, taking hostage, trying to force conversions and assimilation. And that's going to have a long-term impact. The original generation and what is left of that group that has been targeted will have biological, societal, and psychological symptoms. Post-traumatic stress disorder, absolutely. Loss of resources, absolutely. Depression, suicide. And then what happens after that is that the impact of this trauma is so great that they share it and they convey it, both biologically through the DNA and through environmental and social factors, how they talk about the trauma, the narratives they tell, and also how they continue to experience prejudice and discrimination. So what is not only happening with the Taliban now, but what is happening 10 years from now? And so our first generation is experiencing this as well. Death, mass killings, suicides, homicides, extreme illness and bodily injury, the rape of the women, the loss of property, losing their land, being moved off of their land, and then this level of subordination. So you're seeing the Taliban try to reinforce this power over in a hierarchy by subordinating others. And that first generation has very little choice in how they handle things. Because what we know is when you can't escape a stressful situation, because your fight, flight, freeze, or appease is only designed to be a short-term interaction, when we like step on the gas and leave that going for extended periods of time with no relief, you begin to see all of those negative adverse consequences for them. People may be fleeing, they may be incarcerated, there's separation of families. We see this happening right at the US-Mexico border here. The loss of autonomy. Where can I go? Out? No, I can't go out. I'm confined to my house. The restriction of cultural expression, how people grieve, how people get married, who they marry, is often all very much controlled. And then there's this design to eradicate an entire culture by prohibiting the use of their very own language. And all of this leaves that first generation completely dependent on the dominant generation. And that is where they are left. I went to one of our indigenous peoples' reservations here in the United States. And I have never seen such poverty there as I had ever seen anywhere else in the globe. That is an active means that we are perpetrating right now of genocide. That eradication, that refusal to give resources.
Yeah, Deborah.
Yes.
In India, Ravneet says that her grandparents experienced trauma because of the partition with India and Pakistan, and which is carried to them, to us as well, she says. And
can you say in what way?
Yes, Ravneet.
I see
like
that there is certain type of behavioral pattern, like we are all in survival mode, we are not relaxed. I feel that we have carried it for so long that even my parents don't realize it, and I saw that in my grandparents as well. So it was like, we had limited resources, they had limited resources, and they used to function in a very limited way. So that I saw in my parents, and then I saw that pattern carried in me as well, even though we had more than them. So those beliefs, that fear and sense of insecurity is very deep rooted, not out loud in front of us, but if we go at subconscious level, it is there, because prominently in our environment we don't have any threat to us, but we still carry those things. Yeah,
you absolutely do. There may not be that immediate threat that your grandparents had, but there is still that uneasiness. There's still that chronic stress that comes with it. Absolutely. And as you were pointing out so beautifully, you've carried it for so long that in a way it almost feels normal. And so not carrying it, what would not carrying it feel like? So to go back to the question we started with at the beginning, what would it be like if this structure weren't in place? And sometimes it's really hard to even envision. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that is absolutely spot on, because this prolonged stress has incredible impact on our bodies. We have difficulty with our immune response. We have difficulty with other traumas then. We're primed. We may not even realize it. Our moods may be upset, our gastrointestinal functioning, sleep and wake cycles, and gene expression for subsequent generations. If we think about DNA as being sort of the on-off switch for hormonal expression to create other mechanisms within the body, then when that changes, we are fundamentally different. And so there's this change in our nature, and there's also a change in the nurture. Stuck again. And then because of all of that stress that is unremitting and unrelenting, our children see it. I don't know how many of you have children of your own, but I can certainly tell you that when I come home after a stressful day, my daughter would be the first one to point out, hey, you're hangry. They're very much aware of our suffering, even when we try not to show it. So what are they learning about our suffering? They may be learning the ways in which we have tried to cope in ways that weren't productive, but we needed for our survival at the time, such as often with intergenerational alcoholism. And then by the stories we tell, kids listen to everything, right? They want to know, they ask why. So what is the both individual narrative about that trauma? And what is the collective narrative about that trauma? In my family, I had relatives that died in the Holocaust. My grandparents were of the mind that never again was that going to happen. We will always talk about it so that it doesn't repeat itself. That was a personal family narrative that was passed to me, that gets passed along. And also when we have been so traumatized, and trauma impacts our ability to have trust and faith in the world, and this is a life-altering event, it makes it harder for us to establish connections and attachments with our own children, with our partners, with our family members. And so it is, again, this individual and collective transmission of violence. And physical generations, as you were saying, you may not even be aware of it, but you feel stressed. And then there are physical diabetes, cardiovascular disease, depression, shame and feelings of powerlessness. So when we're talking about motivational factors for violence, shame, humiliation, rejection, and ridicule are the big four, which we'll talk more about. But it can be experienced both individually as shameful for one person, or shameful as a group. And a lot of that has to do with how that group processes and makes meaning out of the event. And direct descendants have all kinds of difficulties with behaviors because they don't feel attached, because they are feeling under pressure, even if they don't recognize the cause. And so they may turn to things like substance abuse, or reenact domestic violence, or not be able to work, or feel this kind of generalized anxiety. These historical loss symptoms make it much easier for the dominant culture to stay in that position. So it is by design that they are hoping that those who are perceived as less than and oppressed have this kind of presentation. It's by design. That's how insidious it is. So then subsequent generations can do one of two things. They can either reject the entire dominant culture and isolate themselves, or they can take on the same behaviors as the dominant culture. We see this with children who have been physically abused. Some of them grow up to abuse others. Some of them will abuse themselves, and some of them won't abuse anyone. So just as there are those parallels in a dominant culture. So that's why it is so hard to pinpoint, because it is not always so easy to spot. But the current generation then has lost so much sight of the protective and promotive resiliency factors that kept their culture alive, that they're left with nothing to hold on to. And so here's an example where we took indigenous children from Native Americans and put them in boarding schools, kept them away from their families, kept them away from their culture. And now many of them can't speak their native language or have no idea about the oral history. Compounding all of that is the trauma that occurs every single day that's ongoing. Those microaggressions and microinequities, the unwillingness to look at the system. So we then see this perpetual thing where people tend to stay stuck. And yet we look at it from the outside and say, oh, it's because they didn't do X, Y, and Z. No, it's not because they didn't do X, Y, and Z. It's about what had happened to them, both individually and as a collective. So we want to be able to mitigate this effect, right? We want to be able to the person who was talking about education, absolutely, to include people in more of their own rituals. I know Nancy was talking about in her brief situation about the Day of the Dead, right? Keeping hold of or reinvigorating, and also by them providing the resources necessary for this long-term and comprehensive healing. Traditionally here in the US, mental health is partitioned down to like 8 sessions. I don't know anybody who can solve anything in just 8 sessions. So if you're thinking about an entire culture, it took a long time to get to where we are. It will take a long time for us to dismantle it. But I hope what you understand as we go through this is by knowing these pieces, we can dismantle it. All right, I'm going to stop here for a minute and let any of you ask any questions you'd like at this point. Anything you'd like more clarification on. Okay. See what we have in the chat.
Yeah, Deborah, there's a very interesting question from Mandeep Singh. How does an imbalance in brain chemistry or poor nutrition relate to depression? Is there a relationship between the stressful, busier lives of today's society and the rise of depression? And how grief or a major medical condition lead to overwhelming sadness and depression, which sounds to me like it certainly relates to COVID.
Oh, absolutely. It absolutely does. And yes, an imbalance in the brain chemistry can make for a particular vulnerability to the way in which the trauma is interpreted, right? If we don't have enough serotonin and we don't have enough dopamine, there's a vulnerability, and we can very easily then, when something occurs, not have enough brain chemicals available to us to be able to cope with that. And so sometimes it is in fact changing your diet. There's a lot of good nutritional ideas about gut health today, and its relationship to depression, and also antidepressants that we do give to people. What we have to remember about antidepressants is that once we give somebody an antidepressant, their brain stops making that neurotransmitter on its own. And so when people stop taking it, the brain doesn't automatically go back to the baseline that it had before any drug was introduced. In fact, now there's a deficit. So they're even more vulnerable. This is why getting on and off of medications can be incredibly challenging in the midst of all of this. Let me answer the other question. I have to go up a little. Is there a relationship between the stressful, busier lives? Yes, there absolutely is. There is a relationship between the way in which we perceive that stress. So there's good stress, eustress. This is stress around things that bring you joy, like getting ready to go on vacation, right? So I'm all excited. That's a positive stress. When we have more negative stressors, that's when our lives are more likely, or we're more primed to experience depression, particularly if all of those things don't get accomplished or remain uncertain. Because anything that's uncertain, our brain encodes as a threat. So anything that's ambiguous, that is unclear, and that's all of COVID. Let me answer the last, I have to go down a little bit more. And the last question, I can't see it.
Last part had to do with how grief or major medical condition can lead to overwhelming
finding their words. When they have psychomotor retardation, they move very slowly, and they may in fact have some unrealistic thoughts, including thoughts about suicide. So it absolutely can start off as grief, and depending on how one processes it and what help and support one gets through it, it can either remain grief or it can go further. Was there a question after that? I thought there was.
No, there were no questions there.
No?
No.
All right.
There's one question. Sorry. Bhavna just now said that sets in victim's mindset where one does, where does one learn to regulate life by oneself?
So yes, there is this notion of learned helplessness, which is when I cannot escape, I will stop trying, and I will resign myself to that. However, there is also learned optimism, where by the resiliency factors, the promotive and protective factors are called upon to assist one's purpose in self-regulation again. So absolutely. Okay. All right. Shall we continue? So when I'm talking about all of these things about violence, you may be asking yourself, okay, it transmits from one person to another, from one generation to another, but how does that actually work? So I'm showing you this as violence is like an infectious disease. And we'll start at the top. The first is the exposure to some sort of traumatic event, either individually or collectively, right? And it is transmitted, that exposure is transmitted through violent action. And that action can either be visible, as in direct assault, or invisible as structural violence. What happens then is that the person who is now experienced and been exposed to has gotten this virus, right? If it incubates within them, if they ruminate over it, if it becomes wedded to feelings of fear, anger, and shame, it gets incubated. This violence incubates, like in a petri dish. And the more and more that grows in that petri dish, the more likely we're going to get somebody who exhibits those full-on symptoms that we were just talking about. The suicide, the depression, the substance use, okay? And then that person who has those symptoms desperately is suffering, wants to get rid of those feelings, and can either do it towards violence towards themselves to alleviate pain temporarily, or they can direct it to violence towards another to discharge the tension. Once that is discharged, it is exposing other people. So if you can envision this as one cycle connected to another of these cycles connected to another, what you wind up having is a whole galaxy or constellation of the ways in which this gets transmitted. And I want to make sure we understand this very clearly, because the antidotes, the ways to mitigate this, target this model, right? So I want to make sure we understand that you have the exposure first. It is either through violent action, visible or invisible, and then it incubates in the person. This is where also that resentment comes from, the contempt, the dismissal, the frustration, along with the physiological arousal symptoms, by the way. So poor sleep, difficulty eating, intrusive thoughts, difficulty regulating memory, and then all of that becomes a full symptom picture. And then that person has to do something because that gets to be intolerable. There's an internal escalation and tension, and they are either going to take it out on oneself and internalize those negative beliefs about themselves, or turn it towards the other. All right. So I'm going to ask you before we continue, do you think violence is ever necessary? What do people think? So, no, not at all. Okay. You say no. If you did say yes, when would violence be necessary? Think for a moment if you thought it was necessary. Self-defense of a child. Aha. Yeah. I would certainly say no. War between two nations. Absolutely. So we often think as offensive and defensive, right? Thinking about, is violence necessary? And we have to understand that it serves a purpose. Right? Is it a pro-social purpose? Like as in children, or is it maladaptive, as in the internet? So I want us to understand that it is an incredibly powerful problem-solving mechanism, but it's temporary. It will not bring the lasting change that we hope. So it isn't that we need to meet force with force, right? And most of us have experienced and seen this kind of violence. And what happens is, if you have, let me just raise your hand or put it in the chat. How many of you have siblings, sisters and brothers? One? Yep. Many. Great. All right. Beautiful. Fantastic. How do siblings fight? What happens? Well, usually what happens is one person will start, and then they may yell or get their voice tight, and then a sibling might escalate over them, try and talk over them, interrupt, justify what they're doing. And then this just escalates one after the other after the other. But what would happen if somebody started up here, and instead of going up here, we came down here? This is how we're going to begin the long-term process of healing, because violence begets violence, and hurt people hurt people. And until we recognize that, we will not be able to interrupt the violence as we need to. Have any of you seen a violent episode and tried to challenge it or stop it? And if so, what did you see? Submissive, absolutely. Over petty things, absolutely. And parents that interrupt, yes. Yes, exactly. Well, those same kinds of things happen, right? When we bring others into it, because there's an attempt to dominate or force one another to back down, back away, but that's not really resolving the issue behind it. And so when we think about interrupting violence, it isn't just that we have to interrupt the behavior that we're seeing. We have to get to the meaning of that behavior, why it showed up in the first place. And so part of the de-escalation that we're going to talk about in the next few sessions is how to do that, how to get to the meaning behind it, how to get to the thinking part of the brain when the reptilian fight, flight, or freeze part of the brain is on fire and people are hijacked by it. So here's how we interrupt this whole cycle of violence. The first thing that we're going to do is when somebody is exposed to a traumatic environment or a traumatic situation, we're taking the time to do this primary prevention. That means getting to know people, getting to know their histories, getting to know their past, getting to know their resiliency factors. This is where we go into schools and we have that discussion. This is where we go into police departments and we talk about trauma. This is where we talk about trauma with our legislators. This is where we talk about our trauma and exposure to it with additional policymakers, so that exposure to a trauma is mitigated. It doesn't go as far and touch as many people as it might if left unchecked. So for example, we recently had flooding in New York City. It impacted at least 20 people who died. What the organization failed to do there was to take an assessment prior to this of all of the places that had flooded previously. Because the best predictor of future behavior is a past behavior. So when we don't take the opportunity to make a good assessment, the next time it gets transmitted or grows, right? Once that transmission grows and gets to an individual or a culture or a collective, and they're sitting with the shame and the anger and the fear and the resentment, if we intervene and we offer compassion, empathy, and pride, which happen to be the antidotes to those three things, then it can stop right there. It can heal in that individual. That individual can build an immunity towards it. And how do we do that? Well, we offer psychological services. We show that people matter. We address the issues behind the violence, not just that the violence occurred. If it does fester in someone and we don't catch it there, then the next thing is when it begins to blow, we introduce these secondary prevention strategies, how we talk to people, where we stand, what we say, how we offer options. All of those are de-escalation strategies, which we will talk about, that can prevent this incubation from becoming a full-on symptom profile in an individual or a collective. We can diffuse what could potentially be much more catastrophic. If we have one person who does in fact get hurt, so for example, the doctors that have been hurt in India right now, the individuals, if we support them after the fact, if we are there for them, if we avoid re-traumatizing them, if we begin to review all of the policies and procedures that may have left them vulnerable, then we can prevent it from transmitting to the next site, to the next doctor, to the next family, et cetera, et cetera. So this whole cycle of violence as an infectious disease can be interrupted. And that's amazing. That is unbelievably good in terms of understanding the hope that comes from that. If we're thinking about violence as being an outgrowth of despair and loss of hope, then to be able to see it and in its healing capacity is incredibly valuable. Because what we know is that absolutely nothing happens in a vacuum. Nothing happens in isolation. It is all interconnected. And that's what I want us to think about for the next several sessions, is how is this connected to what I am experiencing, to what I am seeing, to what is happening to my family, to what is happening to my profession, to what is going on in the world. Because all of these pieces, the institutional, the structural, the personal, the direct, are all happening simultaneously all the time. And exposure to trauma over time occurs in the context of community. An individual is part of a larger collective, and those collectives belong to neighborhoods of shared identity, ethnicity, experience, organizationally, work, learning, and worship. I want you to think even more about culture in terms of what is your work culture? What is your team culture? How do people feel about supporting one another? Your most recent survey reports 80% of doctors are stressed out in their position and their profession. That's an incredible number. Violence is not in anybody's job description. Nobody woke up and got a job description that said, today I want to be hurt. Today I want to be assaulted. So we have to understand how these factors come into play in order to mitigate them. Because the communities that provide this context for understanding facilitate the healing and recovery process. The fact that we have 38 participants in this training, to me, is a godsend, is amazing, because each and every one of you are recognizing that this is something that needs to be addressed. And the more people that understand this, the more likely it is that we can change individually, collectively, and systemically. Because what we're really looking for when we talk about safety are these things. Physical safety. This is often where organizations start and stop when they think about safety. They think about, well, where is that person located? What are they saying? What is happening to them? Here it is, it could be what kind of PPE you have, right? What's the layout of the organization or the building you're in? Or how many assaults have there been on staff? So oftentimes our vision of violence is this is too narrow, way too narrow. Because what we really need is all four of these. The psychological level of safety is about how skillful and prepared you feel to do the work that you do. How do you take care of yourself and build resiliency practices for you in order to serve? You can't serve from an empty vessel. If you are depleted, you are more at risk for getting hurt and for others getting hurt. So it becomes sort of an ethical obligation as healthcare workers that we also engage in the very same self-care practices and resiliency that we share with our patients, right? So it's very important that we are feeling like we understand the population that we're working with. We know where we're going and that we have the training and we have the support. And then there's this social element, right? How much can we rely on our colleagues? Are there enough of colleagues around? Am I the sole person? How do I connect with my colleagues? Does my supervisor or organizational leader support my decisions in regard to patient care or personal safety? Is my workplace free of harassment from other colleagues, bullying, shaming, intimidation? And lastly, but often most importantly, that organizations fail is in this notion of moral safety. How much of what we are doing is fair, firm, consistent, transparent, and authentic? How much of what we are doing is walking the walk? If we proclaim to do one thing and yet we turn around and do something else, that creates a cognitive divide that somebody else is going to encode as a threat because it's ambiguous. Okay, so for example, I understand that there have been doctors who have been hurt when a bill is presented because the bill wasn't what the family thought it was going to be at the end. Not having a transparent or readily accessible means to understand that part of the work later on leads to unfulfilled expectations, which are coded as negative threats. And so there's this compensatory response to make it right. We need to genuinely walk our walk. And if we are in fact saying that this power over platform, this structural mechanisms of violence have to be dismantled, then we have to walk that walk and model that for ourselves, for our families, and for our patients. Because we all have fundamental needs for feeling safe in the world, for wanting predictability and success, and be able to sleep and eat and have housing. Critical needs. When those needs are not met, fear arises. And the longer that fear goes unchecked, the more angry, the more loss of hope, the more that essential needs are not available or people are denied access, they will increase their behaviors. Why? Because they're trying to get the attention that they need. I sometimes hear clinicians will say, oh, don't talk to that person. It's, it's secondary gain, or they're med seeking, or they are being manipulative. That's not it at all. If somebody has to engage in this level of needing attention, give them attention. We are social creatures. That social network is vital for our survival, and we'll talk more about that in our next session. But nobody woke up wanting to hurt themselves in the morning in order to just get attention. There is something more going on there. And when we ignore it and we turn a blind eye to it, it will escalate. So the earlier you notice it, the more you make visible the invisible, the safer you will be. The safer you will be, the safer your patients will be, and the safer will be the people witnessing any interaction will be. Because it is all about the intersectionality of all of these things, about how relationships are formed with the trust, the compassion, the pride, what cultural values are at play, how your brain is reacting, how your nervous system is reacting, what your individual trauma history is, and your collective trauma history. And they're all overlapping. And you cannot just pull one of these and expect that things will be different. Because what we know is that to really heal is to touch with love that which we previously touched with fear. Violence cannot be solved with violence. Trauma cannot be healed with inflicting other trauma. The only thing that heals is compassion, empathy, and pride. So now I'm going to open it up for your questions. We have some time. Feel free to ask whatever questions you would like.
Deborah, I was thinking people resort to violence when they feel they have no other options for addressing their issue, at least some of the time.
Yes, Nancy, absolutely. When they feel as if there is no official channel to go through, they're going to be heard in whatever other way they need to, and that absolutely includes violence. And part of the fight, flight, or freeze response is the fighting response, is that violence, absolutely. Other questions? I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see you all. So, So what did you learn? What is your takeaway from today? Tell me one thing you learned today that you didn't know.
There are some positive comments, Deborah. Thank you.
Oh my
Once
goodness.
amazing, compassion heals. And Mandeep Singh says, I want to spend more time in these blessings.
Absolutely. We are trained to treat with empathy and compassion. Please give some examples of pride. Absolutely. So pride has to do with fostering self-esteem in another, in having them feel as if they matter. We will actually spend time, I believe in the next session, delving into the concept of mattering and how to foster pride as that antidote to shame. It is fostering that capability, that mastery, that self-efficacy in another. Absolutely, empathy, not sympathy. You got it. Oh, as counsel, compassion is too costly. Compassion can be too costly. We will talk about compassion fatigue, but we will also talk about compassion satisfaction. That there is a way in which we can refuel that train. The role of shame, absolutely. Shame, humiliation, rejection, and ridicule, the primary 4 drivers in any kind of escalation.
And Deborah, that reminds me, there's the anniversary of 9/11 coming up. And I think the sense of shame that Americans felt led to a lot of national violence against other places.
Agreed, it certainly did. And it also illustrates that media does have a role, even though it's not recognized as such as in the DSM-5. In fact, it's excluded. It really does have an impact. And most of us remember where we were on that day as well.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
Boundaries with compassion, I need to learn. Absolutely. The good news is you can. You can learn these things. These are like a muscle. The more you practice, the better you get. And that's exciting. Any other thoughts? Well, yes, love affection with our future. Absolutely. Pass that forward, because just like violence is contagious, so is positivity. So is optimism. And as we saw where we can interrupt, that's how we inject those things. Oh, I'm so glad people found this very helpful. I hope many of you, or all of you, will join us again on Thursday morning. And if there is anything that you'd like in between, I can I can show you my email for a moment if you'd like, and you can take that down. Oh, I didn't put it there. Okay, I thought I had. My email address, for those of you who may want to email me and ask some questions, is SPH. Actually, I'll put it in the chat. That makes it easier. sphinxdbh@yahoo.com. So if you would like to reach me, I'm happy to.
There's one question here in the context of prolonged stress. One of the points, the startle reflex, rather, she wants you to elaborate on that.
Sure. So one of the things that trauma does is it makes us hyper vigilant, hyper aware of our surroundings. And so we can easily get shaken up by loud sounds, loud noises, because our body is ready then for fight, flight, or freeze. It's the equivalent of waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the next bad thing to happen. And that's your body's way of telling you that there's a perceived threat, even if your brain doesn't spell out threat for you. So your body remembers trauma. It bears that burden. What do I get for hope to get out of it. What do you get out of acting compassionately? We're going to spend some time with that. It gives you far more social adeptness. It increases your resiliency. It reduces your own stress level. It allows for more proactive problem solving. It is actually the off switch physiologically to the fear response, which you will need when you de-escalate. So you benefit and they benefit from this technique. And we'll spend some time absolutely talking much more about compassion.
Deborah, it sounds as if you can be more effective when you're compassionate.
You most certainly can be, because what you're bringing online is the frontal part of your brain that does the problem solving, does the judgment, does the creativity, that can abstract. You're moving it away from the reptilian brain of fight, flight, or freeze. Yes, we will be covering transference. Absolutely. You don't have to like everybody you work with for this to work. Respect privacy. I'm not sure what that means. Does somebody want to clarify that? To be trauma informed in our work, the question is always to have them about what could have happened. Absolutely. You're asking not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you, and even more so, what's strong in you and the person that you're working with. Because it's what's strong in them is what will override the instinct to hurt another. All right. I thoroughly enjoyed all of you. You have so much collective wisdom in this room. As always, I feel very blessed to spend this morning with you. And I look forward to seeing many of you, or all of you, I hope, Thursday morning.
Yes, so thank you, Deborah, for the wonderful presentation. I think the responses from the participants is, evidence to that. And thank you all also for being here, taking your time, and also sharing your thoughts, adding your comments and questions. We look forward to seeing you again on the 9th. And I also take this opportunity to wish Deborah Rosh Hoshana.
Thank you. Can Kala, Nancy, and Uma, could you stay on for just a minute?
Sure.
Yeah, Lashantova,
Okay.
Deborah.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, everyone. Thank you so much.
One of the
Have a
participants is asking about materials. Will that be sent later after
Yes.
all the sessions, or yeah?
Yes, I will send out a reference list so that people can have that. And I will also send out some video links.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Ask as many questions as you would like.
Okay.
Good, good, good. All right. Or you can
Oh,
just
the next
email me
one.
if you'd like.
Okay.
I'll answer as many as I possibly can.
Nipita Lochanji, we can now stop recording,
Yeah.
if that's okay with you.
Yeah, sure, sure.